So, welcome to Intro to JavaScript. Um, so, what I'm hoping we can do is just start making a mental map between the things we know already about programming and how they're done in Ruby and how they're done in JavaScript, how much of it is the same, which parts are a little bit different, and hopefully like this sort of refines our mental models around what programming is. So what I'd like you to do first is I want you to take, I'm gonna say 5 minutes. I want you to take 5 minutes and write me a Slack message with everything you know about programming. So I want to hear about loops. I want to hear about conditionals, all variables, and just brain dump everything that you know about programming. Learn from the pre-work, learn from Ruby, just dump it all. 5 minutes, go. Another 30 seconds. All right, send me whatever you got. These are really good answers. And even if you think you don't really know a lot about programming, I'll bet you know more than you think. But I'm seeing lots of good stuff in here. And here's like kind of the interesting part about this. I know we're like really early on in our programming journey, but let me pick on someone. Cool. So Matt Malecki, would you read your answer? It was really good.
Okay, let's see. Variables, functions / methods, data types, loops, conditionals, iteration through loops, classes, arrays, hashes or objects, scope, joining methods, hoisting, prototype, bubbling, DOM manipulation.
Cool. Like, that's like 80% of programming right there. There's not this whole fucking mountain of other things. What happens is we go a lot deeper into all of these ideas. But even that, a lot of it is combining them in really interesting ways. But there's not loops and then other loops. Those enumerables that we did in Ruby, those are the same like enumerables that pros use. Actually, I want to show you guys something that was kind of funny. This happened yesterday. So in the TypeScript channel, me and a guy named Chandler Prawl. Make sure. Okay, that's on. He's probably Denver's like foremost expert in performance. So we were talking about TypeScript, and he wanted to do something kind of weird with TypeScript. And he said, "Oh, it was just my first go-to." And then I made a really like shitty programming joke about go-to, which was a programming construct that died out about 30 years ago. And Chandler said, "Well, you know, this I specifically thought of you as I wrote this code earlier today." And I have given about like half a dozen talks on like how much I hate it when people write code like this instead of using the appropriate enumerables and stuff. But like this is super performant code. You know all this stuff. It's a for loop. It's pushing stuff into an array. It's calling a method. Returning stuff out of like this is it. This is programming. This is like I consider this guy to be just about like one of the best programmers I've ever met. And it's for loops and variables and pushing stuff into arrays. Ta-da!
Is the idea that that is more performative because it is just the bare bones, like calling very few enumerables?
Yes. It has to do, and performative is like, I'm not actually doing something, I'm performing like I'm doing something. Performant is like performs very well. And yes, that's exactly why. If you strip away like all the enumerables and all the abstractions and stuff, you get more speed at the cost of clarity, reusability, like lots of other things, which is why I'm generally like a pretty staunch advocate against them. But if the problem you're trying to solve is how do I make this go faster, which is usually the kinds of things that Chandler works on, that's how you do that. Oh, yeah, and then the rest of the joke was, because I crack myself up. So, cool. So no, all the things that you brought up, that's in JavaScript also, all of those things. So like in Matt's answer, we had variables, JavaScript's got them. Functions and methods, JavaScript has both of them. Data types, we got them, but we use them a little bit differently. Loops, almost the exact same ones. Conditionals, almost the exact same ones. Iterating through loops, you do it pretty much the same way. Classes, they both have that word, they both use them slightly differently. Arrays, exactly the same. Hashes or objects, exactly the same, except what is called a hash in Ruby is called an object in JavaScript. Scope, very similar scope rules actually. Joining methods, yep. Hoisting, absolutely. Prototypes, that's what JavaScript's all about. And then this stuff we'll talk about more in Mod 2, Mod 2 and Mod 3. So what I want you to do next is I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite tools. So when I have to learn a new programming language, which happens all the time, because like I'm a problem solver. I'm not tied to, oh, I only use like this one type of hammer. I use any kind of hammer, man. When I started this job, they didn't even ask me if I knew Ruby. They're like, hey, you're a programmer, right? Figure it out. And so I went to this tool called Learn X and Y Minutes. And it looks like this. Cool. So this is a like collection of like Rosetta Stone kinds of things. So it's all these different languages. And if you look through the Ruby one, you'll find all these examples of how Ruby works. And you probably know how to do most of these things.
So it's like a docs dump.
What was it?
Like just the docs, basically, like a big list of them.
It's way more condensed than the docs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not supposed to be exhaustive. It's not everything you can do with that language. It's how you do all of the things that you do in basically every language. So we look over at the JavaScript one. We see how they write comments. We got two different ways we can write comments. We got statement terminations. We're going over how these are optional. So what I want you to do next is let's take maybe a little bit longer. Let's take 10 minutes. I want you to read through Learn X and Y Minutes for JavaScript. I'll put the link in chat. And then I want to talk about it a little bit. Ten minutes. Read up. I'd recommend skipping all the stuff that talks about prototypes. That's not useful for right now. You can skip right to ES6 additions. Another 2 minutes. All right, time's up. So now what I'd like you to do is we're going to take another 2 minutes, and I want you to write me, Slack me the questions that came up while you were looking through that. There has to be some because there's a lot in there. Any questions that came up while you're reading that, 2 minutes, Slack them to me, go. right, slack me what you got. What's in your mind? Such good questions. Keep them coming. Mike Navoy found secret treasure in JavaScript. Floating point math. Don't worry about anything with prototypes right now. Coercion. Ifs. All right, cool. This is a pretty awesome list. So here's what y'all want to know. All right, so semicolons, Varlit, Const, functions, and numerals, switch case. I'm going to reorder these a little bit. Like most important to least important. All right, cool. It's a good place to start. So let's talk about semicolons. They're by and large optional in JavaScript. There's a couple gotchas on them, but it's honestly pretty hard to run into them. So that doesn't mean there's like, so when you leave your semicolons off, they still get added back in, which is the problem. There's this process called automatic semicolon insertion, or ASI. So if you do some statement like let A equal 1, and you leave the semicolon off, when your browser runs the JavaScript, it goes, you forgot the semicolon, and just adds them back in for you. The problem comes if you do something that could be interpreted both ways. So the most common example is if you use the return keyword, and then what you mean to do is like return space A, and you wanted it to insert the semicolon there. What it's actually going to do is put it there, because return all by itself is a completely legal statement. So something happened in the last year or so. Basically, like for the last 5 years, people have been dropping semicolons like a bad habit. Like, I don't have to write semicolons. Thank God. Never liked them anyway. So everybody stopped doing semicolons. And then they added some features to JavaScript in the last year or so that made those ASI gotchas like a little bit more common. And so now everybody's putting the fucking semicolons back in. So your best bet is to set up a linter like ESLint or something like that. It's the exact same sort of deal as Rubocop. That just does whatever the style guide says for you. If the style guide you're using says no semicolons, then just let your linter take care of it. But I, for one, never want to fucking care about whether or not I'm using semicolons ever again. That's what I'd recommend you get to. All right, so there's semis. Other questions about semicolons?
So when you say you don't ever want to care about them, does that mean you always use them so you never have to think about it, or you never use them and then if an error comes up, you deal with it?
I want the linter to worry about it for me.
Okay.
So if I use something like ESLint, and ESLint is set up so that I have to have semicolons, it just puts them in whether or not I do or not.
Okay, gotcha.
Or if I am in a no semicolons code base and I accidentally put a bunch of semicolons in, it takes them out for me. Cool, what else? All right, let's talk about Varlit and Const, which coincidentally is very closely related to lexical scoping. I'm gonna show you this one in code. All right, so I have this empty JavaScript file. And if I do something like const a equals 1, and then if a is less than 5, then do something. Like say const b equals 2. And then console log a and b. All right, so I've declared this variable, and based on some condition, I might declare another variable and then want to log what these two things are. So the thing that surprises people is you expect that to log 1 and 2. Anybody know what it's actually going to log?
One and null.
Not null, good guess.
Undefined.
Undefined. Null is I intentionally, like, it's like a this page intentionally left blank thing in like a legal document. Undefined is nobody's ever even tried to define this before.
Yeah.
So if I run this, B is not defined. Actually through an error even. So that's because let and const are block scoped. Blocks are these things, little curly brackets. They come after if statements, they come after for loops, they come after while loops, they come after functions. Those are blocks. So since this was defined inside of this block, it can't escape up. It's visible to any other blocks that might happen. So like if I do if a is less than 4, that works. You can see all the scopes above you. Can't see down. Can't see sideways. Since this is trapped inside of this block, this thing can't see it. That one can, though. That's called block scoping. That's how most languages work. Ruby's block scoped. No, actually, no, I take that back. No, Ruby's lexical scoped. Most languages are block scoped, though. So the alternative if I did var like that, the console log beep, that still works. It's fine. Now, if I do I try to run this code, check this out. 1 and 2. Because with var, with lexical scoping in general, functions make scope. We have this big global scope that we're in out here. Otherwise, we want to make more scopes. C isn't visible out here. If I do C, that's going to error out, even if I try to call it. If I try calling that, C is not defined. Can't see it. It's trapped inside that function. Functions are the only thing that creates scope in old-timey JavaScript. So as the question, when do you use which? Don't use var anymore. In 2020, there's no reason to use var. I thought lexical scoping was more useful than block scoping. The entire programming fucking world disagreed with me. So people will like think you don't know how to write JavaScript if you use var. So your rule is write const, always default to const. Unless you need to change something and then change it to let. This is kind of like how in Ruby, you'd make something a reader unless you also needed to write to it. But you defaulted to reader rather than just making everything an accessor. Questions about Varlit and Const?
When you say change a const to a let, you literally mean I like go in, delete const, type let. Got it.
Yep.
Not some kind of coercion.
Nope.
Cool.
So you had said that you can see up and not down.
Yes, correct.
Okay, can you go over, because to me, I thought since A, like in this example, A is like global in my mind, it can be accessed down, like through the.
Yes, this inner thing can see up. You're understanding it correctly.
Oh, I see, okay.
A good way to visualize scope, this is for every language too. Every lexically scoped language, that is, which is like 99% of them. You think of these scopes as boxes. You can always see all the boxes that you are in. Nobody can see into another box. It's like one-way mirrors. More questions about let and const and lexical scoping? Default to const. Make it a let if you need to. Don't use var anymore. All right, onward.
So if you're in if you work for a company who has been there for generations and they still have some var stuff, how do you go about editing that? Is there a system you would use to see which ones should be let and which ones should be const, or?
So how should you edit that? Very carefully. This is a thing that tests help with. If you've written tests for your code, then just try making everything const. See what breaks. Those tests, those failing tests that happen when you do that, they'll guide you like, hey, when you restricted this thing broke. So then you try making that a let and see if that works. And if that still breaks, that means you have some lexical scoping that you need to refactor. It's probably the fastest way to do that. Great question. All right, let's talk about switch and case. You have these in Ruby too, and they work the same way. Most languages have switch and case. Switch and case is a kind of complex form of an if-else statement, but that's all it is. So if I did something like if cool, if name if name equals Kyle, else if name equals Naya. Else if name equals Jesse. And then we might throw an else on there. Okay, so like we kind of get this sort of code. Just ifs and else ifs and elses. Since we're always comparing name every time to just see if name is one of some value, that's a common enough pattern that you can write this as a switch instead, and it ends up reading a lot easier. So that exact same code written as a switch would look like this.
Yeah, Ruby has this too, but it uses when, right?
Exactly. And then instead of an else, it's called default. Exact same code. Compiles to the exact same thing. So if all of your else ifs are just comparing different values of the same thing, you're probably better off using a switch instead.
Why is it better? Is switch more readable? Because it seems to be longer.
It's way more readable. So think about like less about length and more about signal versus noise. How could I more concisely express the idea? So all of this, like, all of that is repetitive. I end up typing that exact same thing out every single time, which means that it just starts looking like texture when you're reading it. It makes it hard to pull out the signal from the noise. This, the signal explodes out, and really the only noise in there is the word case. Other questions about switches?
Just to be clear, Kyle, that the if condition then is always that first case line.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just like if else, these go in order. And so these don't have to be values. These could be like tests, basically. It's going to find the first one that matches.
If you don't put the break, will it keep going?
It'll keep looking.
Away?
Yeah, it'll look for more matches.
Okay.
That's called a fall through, and it's generally considered a bad practice. You
Okay.
can do some like pretty powerful, concise programming with it, but it's so fucking easy to like mix that up with just a complete mistake because you forgot to do it that it's generally frowned upon.
Okay.
Does that have to do with the fact that JavaScript doesn't necessarily have implicit returns? Is that related?
Yeah, that's not like related to that, but it doesn't have implicit returns. And so like if I saw this, I would just assume that somebody forgot to put the break in, even if they were doing it intentionally. Other questions about switches?
Can you actually make multiple cases? So meaning let's say if name equals Kyle, and then instead of having a break, you can set, oh, okay, now name equals to somebody else. And then if you don't have the break, you still end up going to the next case. So can you make another switch underneath there?
Yeah, that's that fall through style. It's powerful, and like you can write really concise code that way. It's so confusing to read though. So I'd recommend staying away from it. But yes, it is possible.
Can you use the double ampersand or like the ors in this or no?
Yes, you totally can. Those would like be part of your cases. One of these days, probably not in this, well, we talked about it a little bit very briefly in mod 3. I'm pretty anti-switch. There is a more complicated pattern called dictionary lookup that does the exact same thing. And for magic reasons is like way better for your code. But I've never met a programmer who doesn't know how to write a switch statement. So you should know how to do it too.
Dictionary is a hash, right?
Yes. Or an object in JavaScript. All the same thing. Cool, onward. Coercion. JavaScript is way more loosey-goosey about types than Ruby is. Neither of them explicitly declare their types, but Ruby is statically typed, JavaScript is dynamically typed, or duck typed. The idea is that, so if I'm in Ruby, and I do something like, I take in an input, like from the term, like when you guys are doing your TTY stuff, it ends up being like input equals, shoot, what's the like chomps thing? I already forgot it. To relearn Ruby every 6 weeks.
Gets chomp, right?
Yeah, that's right. Gets.chomp.
Yep.
So I do gets.chomp. If the thing that I'm looking for is a number, like that always comes in as a string, right? So I would have to do something like input to I. I need to tell it that I want to treat this string as an integer. Not so in JavaScript. The equivalent thing in JavaScript would be like, it'll go, all right, can I turn this into a number? If I can, then I will. I can keep using it like a string. I can use it like a number somewhere else. I can use like a Boolean somewhere else. if there's some possible way that it can be used correctly in context, it just does the type coercion for you. You don't have to do it explicitly. You can. You can do something like that. Or, this is arguably harder to read in this case, but it's the exact same thing. That. You can force it to be evaluated like a number. But JavaScript will do its gosh darndest to try to treat, to just figure out how to make the types work. It's called duck typing or dynamic typing. Duck typing because, well, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it swims like a duck, how about we just treat it like a fucking duck? This is called casting. We don't need to do casting in JavaScript. Now, where this gets a little bit gnarly is there's some very good reasons to be fussy about types. And in OG JavaScript, we would do things like we might want to do that. If I pull that 4 in, the second one, from an input, just like gets, everything you pull in from an input's always a string. If I'm comparing it to some ID from a database or something like that, I kind of don't give a shit that one of them's a number and one of them's a string. Are they both 4? Now, there's a lot of problems that you run into doing this. And so almost immediately, one of the first major changes to JavaScript was the addition of triple equals. So that'll be true. That's false. Triple equals compares the value, which is the same on them, and the type, which is different on them. Kind of like we want something to be const unless it needs to be a let. Kind of like we want something to be a reader unless we know we need to write to it. Generally speaking, always use triple equals unless you have a very good reason to use double. And you probably don't have a very good reason to use double. So what you'd want to do instead is force it to cast as an integer, or like that. Questions?
5 lines up where you said sum equals 4 plus input.
Yep.
What type does sum inherit from that?
Oh, super good.
String or 4 is an integer.
It kind of doesn't matter until it gets used.
Okay, but what should we expect it to be? Like what?
So,
What I assume it is in that case.
Actually, this is a really good example of like why duck typing kind of falls apart a little bit. Because if I do this, let's say the input was 4. I would expect that sum is going to be 8. Now here's the fucked up thing. If I flip those around, anybody know what that's going to be?
Is it going to be a string?
Yes.
Like input 4?
Nope. Good guess.
I kind of guessed that, but I didn't know if I was right.
Why?
Because it can cans them.
What was that?
It can cans the.
It concats them.
Yeah.
Because we use the exact same symbol to build strings as we do to do math. And so anytime you're adding a string and a number, Sometimes it does the math. Sometimes it does string concatenation.
So because the first thing it looked at was a string, it was like,
Right.
cool, bet this is strings that we're just smashing up together.
Correct.
Damn.
It's not predictable either. I mean, it does it the same way every time. It's predictable in that regard. There's not very good logic to it. It's not worth memorizing. So a lot of time, if I really want this to be math, pays off to do the casting. Meanwhile, if I want it to be string concatenation, similar kind of thing. I actually would recommend never doing string concatenation with pluses, partially for this reason. So if I did want to do string concatenation, we can do template literals just like we did in Ruby. So in Ruby, that would have looked like that. Almost the exact same thing, just slightly different syntax in JavaScript. That's what it is in JavaScript. Backticks and use a $sign instead of the hash. So I really want to like jam some strings together. I'll use one of those instead of pluses. I try to save the plus symbol exclusively for math. Other questions? Cool. Difference between a hash and an object. I think this is in one of the Learn Labs, but JavaScript uses the word object in a very different way than we used it in Ruby. And I think almost inarguably, you could say that the way that JavaScript uses it is wrong. In like programming, an object is an instance of a class, period. That's what the word object means. Have a little blueprint, have a little cookie cutter, make some instances. Those instances are called objects. Unordered key value pairs, in basically every language, hashes, dictionaries, tuples. There's technically differences between all three of those, but like not really. So this is like mostly a vocab mishmash. Almost all the ways in which you used a hash in Ruby, that's just what we use objects for in JavaScript. Now, we don't really have real classes and real objects in JavaScript. We have some things that sort of kind of look like that, but they technically aren't. Some people say JavaScript has no class. They're right. So this leads to another one of the questions that was on the list. Actually, so difference between hash and object, JS classes, Ruby classes, functions, and objects containing functions. So we don't really have pure methods. So like in Ruby, I might do something like and I might have some method, oh, I guess it's snake case it. So then I might make some like objects out of that. What I'd probably do in JavaScript is something more like this is the single biggest difference between Ruby and JavaScript, is that functions in JavaScript don't have to be attached to classes. There is no such thing in Ruby as a method that's not part of a class. Even when we did Java, what was it, Hashkeball, or those, it didn't look like those were in classes. Everything is implicitly in a class called main. Those are still getting defined in some class somewhere. That's not the case in JavaScript. We can just have random functions that are standalone, like are not attached to anything. And that's really powerful. That's like my single favorite feature in JavaScript. But like that's how we would do an equivalent kind of job of keeping things together. Is we'd have a hash. You can do keys and values on it, except those values can also be functions. So I can do stuff like some object dot some instance variable, and that'll give me hi. I can also do some object dot some method and call functions that way. So that's how I group together state and behavior. But I didn't have to use a new keyword. I didn't have to make a constructor. I'm just grouping stuff together, keys and values. Cool. So first thing I want you to wrestle with JavaScript, this is how you're going to like work up your JavaScript muscles, is you're going to do object ball. It's just like Hashkeball. It's literally the exact same exercise, except we're doing it with JavaScript instead of Ruby. So let's see. All the instructions are in here. Same stuff. You have to build up the object. I would recommend also doing helper methods. It's all the same stuff. And they give you some advice on debugging. I'd recommend reading that. For loops, all the same stuff you had before. Also, you still have map. You still have filter. Or sorry, you still have select. It's called filter now. Select is called filtered, otherwise everything's the same. Blocks in Ruby, same thing as like the functions that we pass into these. So I might have something in Ruby that's like and maybe that's like so this code in Ruby would be this, in JavaScript. Have to write the returns out every time. They're not optional anymore.
Gerald, can you jump on mute?
Or you might also see that written like this. I wouldn't worry too much about the syntax just this yet, but you will see somebody do it. So I don't want you to get freaked out if you see it. Or like this, same thing. That's like the do end block versus the curly braces block, similar kind of idea. But all three of these are the exact same code conceptually.
So like, I have a question. Like, I'm gonna go ahead and copy the method inside the chat. Is that similarly like, you know, functional, or is it better to use this method that I just copied to the chat?
Let me see what you wrote in chat. No, so you can solve the same problems that way, but this is the same kind of shit that I was showing you with like Chandler's code with like the nested for loops and if statements and stuff. If you can find an enumerable that gets the job done for you, I would always use that over a for loop.
Okay.
One last thing. This is not a mod 2 idea. This is a mod 3 idea. This is like a late mod 3 idea. But to give you an idea of what is so fucking cool about JavaScript, let's say I take something like this. .map takes in a function as an argument. That's all that is I'm just writing the function in line, but it's still just an argument we're passing into a map function. If I made this something like that, and all right, so I do something like that. I can take this inner function out and make it its own little standalone function. Like that. Pass a number to it, get twice that number back. And then I can rewrite this like that. And that's awesome. It's like being able to save blocks from Ruby in variables. JavaScript is my favorite language. There's so much cool stuff you can do with it. And it's, whereas Ruby was like very strictly OOP, JavaScript allows a lot of those ideas. It also allows a lot of very different competing ideas. And so you get to like seamlessly jump back and forth for whichever one kind of fits your problem best. You can combine them in interesting ways. It's such a cool language, gang. All right, I'm going to stop there. What questions do you have for me?
Is having a function call itself or return itself good or bad practice in JavaScript?
Depends. It's called recursion. There are some problems that lend themselves very well to that. It's a different kind of loop. So anything you can do with a loop, you can also do with a function that calls itself. And that's actually kind of an interesting exercise to give yourself. Is like, all right, I did this with the loop. Can I do it with recursion? Why you would choose one over the other? A recursive function is computationally very simple, but very expensive in terms of memory. A loop is very cheap in terms of memory and very expensive in terms of computation. So like that's how you answer that question in a computer science interview. I wouldn't worry too much about recursion right now, honestly. But yeah, it's neither good nor bad. It is a different way to solve iteration than loops.
You should Google it too. They made a joke that's there forever.
Oh yeah, that is a pretty good one.
Would there be any time that we'll be learning about like big O's?
We don't explicitly cover it in the program. We do have a computer science curriculum that you have access to right now. The career services folks generally like coach you through. Yeah, like give it a couple mods, especially like during capstones. A lot of times students will ask for like big O lessons and stuff, but it is not explicitly part of the instructions. It's not explicitly a part of the instructions. Talking's hard, but a lot of your teachers like are pretty well versed in big O stuff, so we can talk about it if you want. It's also not that complicated an idea. There's so many of these computer science things that are like, how do I cram a 4-year degree into 15 weeks? It's like, well, when the like program is structured as poorly as like basically every computer science program is, it's actually not that hard. But Big O is a relatively simple idea. You can get strong at Big O in like a week. If everybody's curious about Big O, it describes how something grows. So for every 1 in, if you get 2 out, you would say that it's growing exponentially. So we'd say that's an O of n squared. Ta-da, there's Big O. So the reason it matters is if you go, okay, we have like a catalog and users search through it. Like search on homedepot.com or something like that. If it takes exponentially longer to search with every product that you add, there's a pretty finite limit to how big your catalog can get. So that's an indication that you need to have something that has lower complexity. And there's a whole host of strategies for how you identify what the big O of something is and how you get it down and that sort of stuff. A lot of it is just memorizing. Cool. What else?
So more logistically, would you recommend that we start chipping away at object ball like today?
Yep.
Yeah.
I would say that is a mighty fine use of the rest of your day. I do recommend Christine's CSS lesson in half an hour. But both of those perfectly acceptable uses of your time. Any other questions? Happy JavaScripting.